I love that medley because it's kind of like a whole journey, right? Of recognition of who we are, recognition of who God is, and because of who God is, and because of sorry, I'm going to block your way. Because of who God is, and because of who we are, because of God, uh, then we recognize like that's how I fight my battles. Like just standing in His presence, being in His presence, and a recognition of who He is and who I am because of Him. I love it. So, good morning, everybody. How we doing? Doing good? Yesterday was a good day. I had a really good day, so I'm feeling really good this morning. JD and I went over to Wilmore yesterday morning to the Wilmore, the vineyard over there, and I got to share with, what would you say, 25, 30 guys? 100, 120, I don't know. No, it's probably 25 guys. And it was a really good time just to be with them and make some new friendships and to be able to share with them kind of the message that y'all have been hearing for about 3 years now. But they got to hear it maybe for the first time about who they are in Christ and because of Christ. And it was just a really, really good time. So this morning, we're in this series called Back Against the Wall or Back Against the Wall. And kind of explained last week, we're looking at people who are in situations with their back against the wall, right? They're trying to make decisions. They're in a position of feeling trapped. You know, what are we going to do? How are we going to get through this? How do I respond? And of course, it involves a wall, right? Of some kind, somehow. Last week was the story of Rahab. She lived in the wall. Well, her house was in the wall, connected to the wall. And she was very much in a situation of being up against it, right? Of having to decide, I'm in a predicament. How do we get out of this thing? And then we related, of course, all of that to labels and identity and all that kind of thing. So, and last week's story, we were talking about the wall of Jericho, and that was a wall that was coming down, right? Well, this is a week we're talking about a wall that's going up. And we're going to look at the book of Nehemiah. And the book of Nehemiah and his rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem, it's kind of like there's a couple of books in the Old Testament that you look at, and when you read them, it's like this whole thing is a story, like one story, right? So Jonah, Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther, those kinds of books, right? So, I mean, I could just sit up here and read the whole thing to you, right? But that would be kind of boring. Well, maybe not boring, I don't know. That's not what we're going to do. So I'm not going to retell the whole thing. We are going to read some pieces from it, but basically you need to know a little bit of history first. And the history of what's happening in and around Nehemiah is that both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, which make up what we understand to be Israel, right? Both of those territories have been conquered at this point, okay, at the time of Nehemiah. First by the Babylonians and then by the Persians. The Persians took over, all that kind of thing. And so the heyday of Israel is kind of over, okay? The heyday of when David was king, when Solomon was king, those times are long, long gone. This happens about 70 years after that, right? So almost a whole lifetime, you can think, after some of that has happened. And what happened is when those countries, when they took over, or when those kingdoms took over Israel and Judah, they destroyed the cities and they took people with them, right? They took captives. So they were captives, they were slaves, and then they sent other people in to the community, and that's just kind of the way it was. So what you have is you have a people group that are slaves in various foreign lands, captives in various foreign lands. And so Nehemiah, this book takes time, or a decent amount of time has passed. It's been 70 years. And what was prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah is that Jerusalem would be rebuilt. And what happens is if you read the first part, the last part of 2 Chronicles and the first part of Ezra, it's a fulfillment of that prophecy. And I think it's Cyrus, king of Persia, says, we're going to rebuild the temple. We're gonna in accordance with the prophecy, we're gonna build the temple in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's gonna be back on its city. So you have this move of like we're gonna move Jerusalem, or we're gonna rebuild Jerusalem to kind of not necessarily to its former glory, but all the threat of them as a people to conquer us is gone, and we're gonna kind of restore this place, this city. And so Zerubbabel, and then Ezra gets permission from the king to go rebuild the temple. And so they go and they're back at it. So some people go with Ezra. He has permission to take the priests and the Levites back with him to institute this worship in the temple, to build the temple and then institute the worship. He's been given authority to set up judges and magistrates and all this. So there's like a structure that's starting to happen in Jerusalem, okay? And Nehemiah was not part of that group that went. Nehemiah was still in Babylon, and he is a slave. He is a servant. He's a cupbearer to the king, okay? So he is a slave, but it's kind of a high position because he's got direct contact, regular interaction with the king of this whole kingdom. And so the first part of Nehemiah that we're going to read from chapter 1, so Nehemiah chapter 1, what's going on is some people have gone back to Jerusalem to kind of work on the temple, see how things were going, and to interact with the people that were still there, because there were some that escaped captivity. Not everybody was taken as slave, right? So there were some people that had gone back there, and then those guys come and visit Nehemiah. Nehemiah gets some visitors from people who had gone back, and so they know the status of that. So anyway, we'll read it in verse 1, about the second part of verse 1 in chapter 1. It says, "Now it happened in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in Susa the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came." So Judah, that's where Jerusalem is. From Judah came, and I asked them about the Jews who had escaped and had survived captivity, and about Jerusalem. And they said to me, "The remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and disgrace. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." Now when I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and I was praying before the God of heaven. And so Nehemiah, he hears the conditions that Jerusalem is in. Now this is 70 years later, okay? And I'm sure there's been some abuse of the city even after that. But this is 70 years after the captivity starts. And Nehemiah hears the conditions of this, that it's broken down, that the people that are there are in distress, the wall is not functioning, the gates are burned. It's still a mess, in other words, right? And it hits him. Like, it hits home. He's just kind of overwhelmed by the idea that this land, this is the home of my people. Right? This is where my father is buried. Like this is the condition of this city. And he breaks down and he weeps and he prays and he mourns. And it's not like a passing, like, oh man, those poor people, I feel bad for them. I wonder what's for dinner tonight. Like this, he sits down and he weeps and he mourns for days, it says. And it's not even just days, because when you pick up the story in chapter 2, we're 4 months later, and Nehemiah is still like in this state, right? So it says in the month of Kislev is when he got the news, or you're about to read that in the month of Nisan, that's 4 months later on the Jewish calendar, okay? So he gets the visitors in the month of Kislev. In Nisan, he is still clearly affected by the news of Jerusalem and its state. So in chapter 2, verse 1, it says this: "And it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of the king of Artaxerxes, that wine was before him," before the king. "And I picked up the wine and I gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, though you are not ill?' 'This is nothing but sadness of heart.'" The king knows, like, you're not sick, but clearly something's going on with you. What is it? "Clearly this is nothing but sadness of heart. And then I was very much afraid. And I said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city and the site of my father's tomb is desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?' Then the king said to me, 'What would you request?' So I prayed to the God of heaven. It's a big moment, right? What do I do here? How am I going to approach this? Then I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, I request that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So he wants to go back. And I think it says, I was very afraid when the king says, what's your request? I was very afraid because he's a slave, remember? He's a servant. He's about to ask the king, can I leave? Right? And even though this is a position where he interacts with the king, it doesn't mean he necessarily has permission to make requests of the king. He's a servant. He's a slave. So he's scared, and he prays, and he says, all right, God, what am I going to do? Am I really going to do this? God, if I'm going to do this, would you go before me and make this happen? And what happens is the king says, okay. What kind of timetable are we talking about? He asks him for a time frame. And Nehemiah gives him a time frame. The queen is there, and they agree. And not only do they agree to send for Nehemiah to go back and to work on the city and rebuild the city, but they say, you know what? We're going to provide the materials for you. We'll even give you permission to take from the king's forest to rebuild the gates. We'll make sure you've got what you need in order to rebuild. So, Nehemiah heads back, all right? So he goes back to Jerusalem, goes back to Judah, to the city of Jerusalem, and he scouts out the walls of the city. He doesn't tell anybody why he's there. So he goes in, and 3 nights in a row, he gets out and he rides around the city, and he's looking at the walls. And there's a point there where it says he rode around the walls, and he went to this gate, and he went to here, and it were destroyed, and the rubble was so bad that he couldn't even get his horse through, right? So it's broken down, okay? But he doesn't tell anybody why he's there. Finally, he does. They're all gathered together, and it says in chapter 2, verse 17, it says, then I said to them, he gathers the priests together, and he says, I said to them, you see the bad situation we're in, that Jerusalem is desolate, and its gates have been burned by fire. Come, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, so that we will no longer be in disgrace. And I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. And then they said, let's arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. So they set on rebuilding, right? Let's do this. You're right. This is a terrible situation. We know. We've been here. You've been here 3 days. We've been living with this, right? But now we have somebody who's like, let's rebuild. Okay? And they agree and say, let's build. Let's arise and build. It's time. And there were a lot of people involved in this. You can read chapter 3, and if you read chapter 3, it's like just a list of names of people like, this family did this, and they built this gate. And this family did this, and they built that gate. And this family did this, and they brought this. And it's like just a list of all the people that were involved. It's a big undertaking. But as they begin the work, it's not so easy, right? As they begin the work, it's not without opposition, even to the point of violence, okay? So in chapter 4, verse 7, it says, now when Sanballat and Tobiah, who must have been guys in the area, right, and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, so other people groups, heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. So all of them conspired together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. So the people who were not Israelites, who were not, didn't have a history with Jerusalem, right, other than to be fighting against it, they didn't want this built back. They didn't want this city there because it was kind of a symbol, like if this wall is in place and if this city is in place, like all of a sudden this group of people who we've taken over and who probably kicked us out in the first place, they're back. And we don't want that, right? We don't want these other people in here to be a power again. that we have to then fight against. And so these enemies come together and they come against them while they're building. And what you see is that Nehemiah, to address this, he divides the workers in half. And half of them continue to work on the wall, while the other half he arms with spears and swords and shields and says, you protect them, right, while they work, while they build. So you've got half the group that is building and half the group that is protecting, right? They're keeping one another safe as they construct this wall. And so finally, through a lot of other stuff, there's a lot of other things that happen, but they work together, they fight off, they keep the enemy at bay enough to complete some work. And in Nehemiah 6, verse 16, it says, when all of our enemies, verse 15, so the wall was completed on the 25th of the month of Elul in 52 days. When all the enemies heard about it, and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they realized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. So it happened in 52 days. They repaired the wall of Jerusalem. They built the gates, and everything's back in place, right? What a good story. I had a friend who had a shirt one time that said, cool story, bro. It's kind of like, okay, right? What a good story. This is one of those times when I read it and I'm like, okay, God, why did you record this? Like, why has this been around for 2,500 years? What's this about? And so we can talk. I began to ask the Lord, okay, well, seriously, like, what is this, Lord? Because this is the wall. It's a great one for the backs against the wall, right? But what about it? And you can take it all different directions. We can talk about the teamwork, right? And how you can accomplish great things together, even amongst adversity. Talk about Nehemiah and his leadership, or about the people who were the first to go back and the risk that they took in doing it, how they bought into Nehemiah's leadership and all that stuff. But it's just like, there's something more here. God, what is it? There's something more. What do you got? Why is it so significant that they built the wall? Why was that what Nehemiah told the king? He said, I want to go back and rebuild the city, right? And when he gets there, the first thing he does is to rebuild the wall. Why is the wall important for the rebuilding of the city? What's the significance there? And so I started asking those questions and thinking about that and people involved. And there's a couple of things that stood out pretty clearly to me. And the first is this. The wall meant safety, right? The wall meant safe. Now, obviously, that's an obvious statement. I get it. A wall that surrounded the city gates, that was the job. That's why you had a wall, to be kept safe inside it. It meant security. But as you think about the people that are involved, right? Think about the situation they're in. Some of these people, well, number one, some of them are still around, right? They're still living. They're the remnant, the ones who didn't get taken off to captivity. Other people are those that came back to kind of rebuild and help those people and establish the temple in Jerusalem. But not everybody was there, right? Not everybody went back. These people have been exiled, and they had been slaves for 70 years. That was their history in foreign lands. And all of that started when the wall came down. Think about it. They were safe inside the city walls until they were broken, right? And so to return to a city that was not safe didn't make sense to them. How many of them remembered what it was like when Babylon came in? When they were overtaken, right? How many of them understood or saw those walls and had some trauma going on in their head about, I remember when I was safe, and then all of a sudden I wasn't, right? The wall was broken down. The gates were burned. And so for the Jewish people as a whole, the security of the city, it would be a big deal. It would be a very big deal. And so even though they were allowed back in, and even though the temple was kind of established and there was some leadership and some government and some things happening, there was no wall. It was not safe. It was no longer a place that they could be and that they could feel safe. You would have thought that it had been a great day when the king said, let's rebuild it, right? You would have thought everybody would have come running, but they didn't. Why not? Why were they in distress, in disgrace? Because Jerusalem wasn't a good place to be at that point. They didn't believe it was because there was no wall. It wasn't safe for them to be there. And so Nehemiah decides what needs to happen is that there needs to be a wall, okay? It has to be built first. Ezra's gone ahead. Zerubbabel went ahead. They built the temple, and they brought some of the leadership and the priests and the Levites in, but there's not people there because it's not a safe place to be. The wall represents safety and security for the people within it. Now, don't take this too literally, okay? But our church needs to have a wall. All right? This needs to be a place where people are safe to live. One of the missions that I see for Capital Vineyard more and more as I interact with people, and especially in this climate of like deconstruction and people not sure about what they believe and they're losing their faith and all of those things, one of the things I see more and more is that we're called to be a shelter for people who aren't sure anymore. And that this is a safe place for them to not be sure. We're called to be a shelter for people who've gone through that process and they're looking to return back to church, but everywhere they look, they see unsafe places because it's what hurt them before. It's what they left before. They're not sure if they can do it because the last time they were there, the gates had been burned and there were holes in the walls and they were attacked and they were beaten up and they were run out. The wall of the city meant some kind of safety for the people within it, some kind of security. Church, we have to create that atmosphere in this place. This has to be a place where people can come and have real questions. A place where people can have real problems, and in the midst of that, be a place where people can come and experience the love of God through Jesus Christ. This has to be a place where you're safe enough to not have to pretend, to not have to pretend to have it all together. A place where you can actually be known by other people and not rejected for the mess that's there. You may or may not know some of the life stories of people in this church. Whether they're here physically or not. But we have so many people who are in this church, who are associated with this church, who were done. That's it. I'm done. I'm fed up. I've had enough of church. I've had enough of pretending. I've had enough of the faking. I've had enough of the judgment when I risked pulling down my mask just a little bit. We have people who were chased away. We have people who ran away on their own. We have people who are unsure about whether they want to be called Christians. They are. They're born again. They're made new. But that title, they're not sure about that title because of the taste that it has in their mouth or it leaves in the mouth of the community around them. We have people who are still sitting at home because they just can't do it yet. Because their last experience with the church was disastrous. We're called to be a safe place. This church in particular, we're called to be a safe place. And I think we're on our way, right? As evidenced by some of the people that call this church their home. But we're not totally there yet, right? This wall's not done yet. We're in the process of building that wall. And remember, the point of the metaphor is not to keep people out, right? That's not the kind of wall I'm talking about. This is a wall where people are protected and safe. To create an atmosphere where it's okay to be honest and be a mess. As Nehemiah was overseeing the building of this wall, this city, right, where it was a place of security for people who anywhere else it didn't feel safe. He wasn't doing it alone, right? There's all kinds of other people that joined in the effort. But these people weren't trained. They didn't know what they were doing. They weren't wall builders, right? They were just people who jumped in and said, yeah, we want that. We want to see that vision happen. We want to be a part of that. And they did it. And Nehemiah said, we need to build a wall. And they said, let's arise and build. Let's do it then, right? They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how everything was going to work out, but they were willing to risk it for the sake of this thing they were trying to do for the city and for the people who would call it home. And it was no doubt for those people to do that work, it was definitely a risk on their part. The wall, to build the wall, was risky. It really was for them. It was a dangerous job. The people of the land around them did not want the wall built. They did not want Jerusalem to be a place where the Jews could live again. And so they came after him, right? We're going to stop this thing. They mocked the work. They attacked the progress. The attacks grew to the point where Nehemiah said, okay, we can't just all commit to building anymore. Now we have to divide our force, and half of us are going to have to protect the other half. They had to protect one another. And the people building had to trust that they were protected as they built. It's not enough for us to hope that this can be a place where people can come and come back and worship and experience community and fellowship. It's not enough for us to hope for that if we aren't trying to create that amongst ourselves. It's going to take us agreeing, yeah, let's arise and build. This is what we want. And when we do decide that, and we begin to take steps into that process, there's probably going to be some attacks. Probably not physically, most definitely spiritually. We're going to have to be able to trust one another in those times to stand by and stand up and defend alongside those being attacked, who are willing to do that work. And if that's going to happen, we have to trust each other. If we aren't living in relationships right now where we're risking trusting one another, then this vision of a safe place for others to come where they can be safe, it's just all talk. It really is. It's never going to happen. Because we're never going to get to be a safe place for others if there isn't trust among the people that are already here. And when the attacks start happening, we need to know that somebody's got our back. We need to know that I've got somebody from the church that I can depend on, that I can trust. Notice what happens in Nehemiah 4. I didn't read this the first time around. What happens is, in Nehemiah 4, when they start to gather momentum for building this wall, Nehemiah 4, it says this: Now it came about that when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry, and he mocked the Jews. And he spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy people of Samaria, and he said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore the temple for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish it in a day? Can they revive the stones from the heaps of rubble, even the burned ones?" He started mocking them. He started bad-mouthing them among his peers, right? That's what was happening. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy people of Samaria. He said, "Who do these people think they are? They can't come in here and rebuild this thing," right? So it starts out as a mocking. It starts out as a bad-mouthing. But when progress starts going, watch this. So, I don't think I have this verse up there. Verse 6, it says, "So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together to half its height." Okay? So the whole way around the city, the wall is at least half its height, even the places that were broken down. Progress, right? We've made progress. Now when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, and the Amorites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. So all of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. All of a sudden, we're not just bad-mouthing people anymore. Now we're fighting. This can't happen. We're not going to allow this to happen. They came against them physically. It increased. It increased and it intensified because all of a sudden it's getting real over there. They're not just talking about this thing anymore. Now it's happening. We're seeing it. And it's taking place. We can't let this go on, is what they decided. If we're really going to create a place that is safe, as we make progress towards that, the need only increases for us to be able to trust each other. It only increases. It never decreases. That means that fighting amongst ourselves is counterintuitive, counterproductive. We're supposed to be protecting one another so the work to continue. We've got to be able to trust one another in this process, protecting, supporting, lifting up one another, providing. We've got to buy into the idea that these are my people, right? Even if they're not my people, these are my people. Do you understand what I mean? We might not agree on everything. We might not like the same music. We might not think the same things are funny. We might be offended by something that somebody else thinks is funny. We might not dress alike. We might not choose to use the same words or have the same child-rearing philosophy or really have anything in common at all. But we have to decide we're going to trust one another. And we're going to have to decide to do that to a level that we don't do that with people outside of the church. And the only way that we can do that is to commit to grace for one another. Grace has got to be in us and through us and around us and covering us from head to toe. It has to become our identity as a people. Because the other thing I see about this wall for Jerusalem is that the wall meant an identity for them, okay? They weren't going to be a people scattered around any longer. They were going to be a people in one place. They were going to be a people gathered together. The wall meant that that was possible, okay? A wall meant that the place was established. There's a clear distinction of where the city was and where the city wasn't. If you're in the wall, you're part of it. If you're outside the wall, you're not part of it, right? So for the people living in this city with this wall all around it, it's an identity. I live there. That's who I am. That's where I am. I belong to that place. That's my home. That's the city. That's the place where I live and I work and I play. Nehemiah is working on this wall, and he's not just building a wall. He's restoring for people a sense of belonging. This is where I am. They've been scattered for 70 years, slaves and foreigners, everywhere they went. They didn't have a home. They lived in certain places, but that wasn't their home. Where they belonged was Jerusalem, where they could worship, where they could be Jews and have a shared culture. The wall was a symbol of identity. This is who we're going to be. This is how we're going to live. It's for us because that's my home. It's for us, and it's for those who don't live here yet, but this is their home. And when the wall was completed, even the people that lived outside of it, even the surrounding people that didn't want it built, saw that wall and knew it was a safe place. When all of our enemies heard about it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they realized this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Grace for one another. Building a wall of grace so that those inside can experience the safety. Grace is our wall. Grace is what protects us. Grace is what gives us an identity as a people. When it was done, even the surrounding people saw God in the work. Grace. When people look at us, let them see grace. Not just for those people out there, but grace in here, right? It's got to be what defines us. It's got to be what sets us apart. It's got to be what allows us to trust each other. It's grace. So it's part of the vision of this church to build a wall, not to keep people out, but to create a place that is safe for those who need it. For those who have come out of an experience where they were not safe, where they were not protected, where the people working alongside them did not stand up and defend them. I want to finish with this last verse. Nehemiah 7, verse 4. The wall's been done. It's been completed. Nehemiah appoints guards. He appoints gatekeepers, all kinds of stuff. And then it says this. Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not built. The wall was built. The wall was built. The city was a safe place to be. It was big, it was spacious, but the people in it were few. Not everybody wants to be in that space, right? But there's a lot of people on the outside who do. And they need to know that this is the safe place. Because we're big and spacious, maybe not physically. I mean, we got some empty chairs, right? But we got lots of room for other people. And we're doing the hard work. And I see moments of trust growing among us. And opportunities for protecting one another. There's all kinds of opportunities for us to protect one another. And I see people stepping up in that. But if people are going to live here, we got to invite the people in. They got to know that this is a place where they're safe. We're committed to that. We've got to let them know that this is a place where they can come to know the love of the Father in the newness of Christ, in safety. Otherwise, it's going to be a big, open, spacious place with just us, which is great. I love y'all. I really do. But there's a whole lot of other people that need to know the love of the Father. And they're scared because of what they experienced before. So we got to build the wall. We got to invite people in. They got to see it, right? And we got to trust one another to make it happen. Trust in the Lord to make it happen, right? Nehemiah was I have no idea who Nehemiah was. I don't know anything about that guy other than what it says right there. He was a cupbearer to the king. He was interacting with the king. Probably wasn't the most glorious job. He was tasting it maybe to make sure that the king wasn't poisoned. So he's risking his life that way. But he wasn't satisfied in that position because he knew his homeland, where he belonged, it wasn't right. Jerusalem was not right. It wasn't what it should be. So he went to help make it happen, right? And I think you can take that metaphor a long way. I'm not always sure that the church is what, not this church, but the church is what it should be. And I think we've got a lot of room to build a wall of grace within the church as a whole. But we can do that right here. We can welcome people back in. We can allow people the room to be messy. And it might be uncomfortable for us. And all of a sudden, it might start getting a little fuller, and we don't have so much elbow room to spread out. And that's not a problem, though, right? That's a good thing. So let's just continue worshiping. I'm gonna pray first before we do. Lord Jesus, I thank you for your goodness to us. I thank you for you being safe. I thank you for you being the ultimate one that we can come to and be a total disaster. Our lives be a total disaster. We're a total mess, and we can come to you, and you wrap us in your arms, and you say, I know. I know. God, I pray that this church will reflect that. We would have the personality of our Father. We would have the traces, the tendencies of our Father to love and embrace. We would draw people into relationship with you so they could be made new in you. That this can be a place, Father, that is defined by grace. It allows us to trust one another, and it allows us to trust you. Lord, we don't want to build a wall to keep anybody out. We're far from that. We're about tearing the walls down, except when it comes to protecting one another. God, would you build that in us? Would you do that work in us as a church? Amen.